Okay, so part two of this week's of topic is I'm going to kind of speak about the research on young people in the DIY music scene and talk about some aspects and some examples that people that have kind of tried to make a job or a career out of it. So the young people I'm talking about here, are creative people. They, are making music, making art. Even some of them would then, were making kind of merch and T-shirts and stuff like that, or they were having their own kind of record labels. All these kind of things around this music scene. And again, as I was saying before, this is outside of the kind of mainstream music industry, and they don't really see themselves as part of the creative industries. They largely see that as kind of almost as from a Frankfurt School point of perspective, that they see that as a culture industry. They tend to have a fairly cynical disposition towards what's been known and come to know in the creative industries. They kind of see it as a kind of hipster thing that they want to avoid. Hipster in the pejorative way that I was using it in the previous lectures. But you have to have a job. You have to eat and pay your rent, and so sometimes they end up working there anyway. And they can see the irony in that. The work that I'm talking around today, this example I'm going to use today, is that in Newcastle about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a kind of small scene that started to burgeon, and it produced a couple of different shops. There was a bar that was opened, a record shop, and a clothes shop, and a couple of other things that were going on. So I'm going to focus on that here. And this scene, again, was heavily connected to the things that I was talking about previously that were going on in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne and the East Coast. And you'll see some of the same young people come up in these quotes as well. So what I'm talking about here is that the kind of what I would argue is a trajectory where these young people build up what Sarah Thornton called subcultural capital, that I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, which is a development of Bourdieu's idea of cultural capital. And kind of invest that subcultural capital, that kind of recognition and reputation and knowledge that they've gained within the scene, to try and kind of make something of it. What's important in terms of the way that works, and if any of these kind of business or entrepreneurial ventures are going to be successful, is that there's an atmosphere of mutual support. The shops, kind of support each other. So, the record shop would. And the bar that opened, would both hold gigs, and they would help each other out with the gear and all that kind of thing. So it's important that within the scene, when this kind of thing happens, that there's not a kind of air of competition. There's a kind of air of mutual support where the people involved are trying to build something that's kind of, I suppose, greater than the sum of its parts. But of course, with any kind of punk endeavour, there's kind of problems with aspects of selling out. So there's an obvious balance here in terms of the struggles and choices made between being an entrepreneur in many senses, but also selling out and making the wrong choices. So what's interesting about this is that a lot of the efforts in this scene is really done through the notion of distinction in many ways, of kind of not being those things. And again, kind of creating an atmosphere for like-minded people to gather together. And that kind of, the traits of what they're trying to gather there are things like, people that are interested in punk music, that aren't as interested in kind of conspicuous consumption and all those kind of alternate aspects. So there's a certain irony there in terms of kind of creating a business around, anti-consumerism. But it's done through a kind of really almost a Marxist understanding of what it means, to be, not in the ruling class in capitalism. That in this sense, there's no such thing as an ethical or good job in capitalism. We're all exploited and alienated in various ways. And so if that has to be the case, this is kind of a pragmatic struggle to kind of at least create some relative autonomy to kind of do things that at least feel good sometimes and don't feel like you just kind of, a rat in a cage, I suppose. So again, these kind of young people are creating a DIY career, an emergent alternative pathway to work and employment. These kind of DIY careers tend to be kind of almost intensely local, in the sense that they, invested in the locality and building something up and having connections with people. But they're kind of nationally and internationally connected. And I'll go into kind of some examples of that in a second. Are they economically sustainable though? Well, not so much. All the things that I'm talking about here, the shop, the record shop, the clothes shop, the bar. The bar still exists, but it's completely different now. Have kind of come and gone, and all the people that were kind of owning them or running them have moved on to other things. So, in some ways, these have ended up being a kind of apprenticeship for those people to kind of move into something else as well. But in some research, particularly in kind of larger places like Sydney and Melbourne, I think where there's a kind of more like-minded people, some of these young people have, been able to develop a kind of, a shop or a bar or a venue or a record label or something that has been sustainable and has been working for, 5 or 10 years. So, there's a balance here between how much these things can be kind of set yourself up for the rest of your life or be a career, and how much they're kind of something that someone does for a while and then moves on to something else. So in terms of the concept of subcultural capital, this is a very prominent development of Bourdieu's idea of cultural capital by Sarah Thornton. And she suggested that while the concept of cultural capital was developed to think about like legitimate fields such as how to do well in education or in the art world or in literature or in the media or in science, Thornton argued that less legitimate kind of spaces in the world, not necessarily that look like fields, but more kind of things like subcultures and scenes, also have kind of hierarchies and things that go on in them that still work a lot like fields, but like probably, don't quite have the same social kind of importance of things like, the economics, politics and science. But nevertheless, for the people participating in them, they're equally as important. And the same kind of hierarchies develop, and in many ways you need to develop capitals to be successful in those kind of subcultures and scenes. So she develops the idea of subcultural capital to think about that, a kind of more specific version of cultural capital, and the ways that kind of, knowledges and things like that within scenes become really important ways of kind of participating in them. Those that then kind of take up important influential positions in subcultures, tend to be the ones that were kind of there first, developing, influential, have a strong knowledge of the kind of history of music and kind of have a really, kind of almost natural understanding of tastes and fashions and stuff like that. So this recasts youth culture as a creative cultural space. It's not, again, a place of just, blind consumption. And this means that things like tastes and knowledges can be developed into ways of developing in a career, or at least developing forms of influence and recognition within that space. So in terms of the research that I'm using, there's some terminology things I think I need to get out of the way. Like as I've pointed out already, I prefer to think about what's going on here as a scene. And in that sense, Will Straw's paper on scenes is the way that kind of influences me here. In terms of cultural and subcultural capitals, well, I think what happens in these trajectories is the young people can turn that kind of subcultural knowledges and capital into kind of cultural capital and then hopefully economic capital. There's a kind of process that goes on here that I'll talk about more. But I think one of the things that is interesting about this in terms of what subcultural capitals do relates to the kind of the notion of aging as well. As I was kind of pointing out that there's a kind of almost a motivation here to avoid those kind of, adult responsibilities of that kind of full-time job of, the rat race of, getting into debt to buy stuff you don't need to impress people that you don't really like kind of thing. This kind of is a way of engaging with what Bourdieu calls social aging, kind of putting off those things until later or trying to avoid them completely. So in this sense, the quote here that Bourdieu talks about social aging is this: their aspirations to their objective chances, to espouse their condition, become what they are and make do with what they have. That is, avoiding kind of succumbing to all that kind of stuff that they don't really want to do. So again, while there's a lot of adult responsibilities in this, I mean, if you're setting up a bar, you're already, got to start dealing with banks and the police and all these kind of regulatory bodies. But at the same time, your job becomes, something that you probably enjoy and, want to invest yourself in. That said, after owning a bar for a while, people tend to kind of then the novelty wears off. Particularly if you're drinking a lot. So there's a transferability going on here. And one of the things that I think is an underestimated thing that happens with these young entrepreneurs is one of the important parts of subcultural or cultural capital more generally is a kind of anticipation of what's important or what comes next in a field. And this is kind of a key form of reflexivity and can be thought of as a form of cultural capital. So, there's a kind of balancing act here with kind of being able to invest yourself and invest your kind of small amount of money you might have into this thing and make it bigger. But also, taking the risk relies on the fact that you think that this is going to be successful in the future. And the ones that are successful are the ones that tend to kind of, have their finger on the pulse and that kind of thing in terms of subcultural capital. What also happens here is that if there's some kind of businesses that develop around a scene, the first ones are normally the ones that take off, and then the kind of copiers and latecomers come along, and those ones try and often copy what's happening in the scene, but tend to die off as kind of seen as pretenders, or they're not the ones really that were entrenched and understand what's going to go, how things work. So in terms of the spaces of these activities as well, it's really important to consider the virtual and digital going on. So obviously a scene, a subculture or whatever happens in particular physical spaces, gig venues, record shops, clothes shops, whatever. But the space of subculture is increasingly virtual as well. The things are promoted on Facebook, and there's blogs and discussion boards and all that kind of stuff. So what's interesting here, I suppose, is the way that it influences various kind of trajectories of the scene and how notions of distinction work and how things get co-opted or not. One of the things important about these kind of scenes is their maintenance of having an insider status. You've got to be kind of in the know to know what's going on in them, to find out what's, when the gigs are and all that kind of stuff. And they actively don't want the wrong people here, The gig announcements often have written on it, "No dickheads," and that's essentially a kind of signal to say we don't want people to come here that are just kind of, blokey drinkers that just want to get drunk. You need to be coming here for the music or the art first, and the kind of, the drinking is kind of a secondary part of it or whatever. Again, it's sort of trying to attempt to avoid a lot of the stuff that I was talking about in the previous lecture about the gender and sexuality and sexism and misogyny that happens in these spaces. So, in many respects, when pre the internet era, when these things were just happening in particular spaces, that was easier because word of mouth was kind of how things worked, and you had to be really much in the know. But today, as things are online and people can search and find out about things, the maintenance of that insider status is more difficult. And people come into these things and don't really get them, and they'll start commenting on the message boards or whatever, and won't really understand what's going on. So in terms of that subcultural capital, the maintenance of it is blurrier. In terms of that us versus them model, where to have subcultural capital, it's about us, and we want to keep the thems out. There's a multitude of thems now that is much more complex and challenging than there was in the pre-internet era. So class is definitely blurry in this sense, and reflexivity is really important as well. Knowing when to invest these forms of capital is important. So timing is everything to get these things right. So the case study. Let's get to the case study. So the specific person I'm talking about here, spent years, he was in his late 20s, spent years, making music, touring around Australia with various bands, developing tapes. He had, pretty good credentials and recognition within this kind of underground scene. He'd been involved in, putting on Sound Summit and other kind of, small festivals. He got hold of a bar that had been run down and closed for years and turned it into a boutique wine bar downstairs, and had an upstairs thing where he wanted to put on gigs and art things and films. It was specifically kind of done in a Melbourne style, in the sense that it was kind of, dark, and there was no big screens, no pokies and all that kind of stuff. He funded the PA system through Possible and raised $5,000 in like 3 days, which is, pretty good in a kind of smaller place like Newcastle. So in many ways, that kind of activity showed that there was a kind of need, and people were kind of really keen to see this place do well. So, as I said, there was a local network going on that kind of, was around this, and all of a sudden these kind of underground labels that didn't really have a place to play in Newcastle started to come, and there was a kind of lots of gigs in this space by these, bands and labels that hadn't been here much before. In Newcastle, mostly, Triple J level bands might come through, but it's actually quite difficult for, more independent and punk bands to come to Newcastle without losing money. So again, remember the distinction here, that there's labels there that are in the list on that slide there. If you don't know them, that's actually important to the kind of subcultural nature of the scene. The bar started to do really well, became quite popular, and in many ways that caused a little bit of tension. Some of the local bands, for instance, didn't really want to play there anymore as it became more popular. But the owner then, built up some kind of capital, I suppose, and with a partner managed to actually buy the building as well. So he wasn't just renting anymore. He managed to buy the building that the bar was in. And since has sold that, so the guy has actually moved out of that venue now. So in terms of, opening a little bar that wants to, support a particular kind of niche subculture, there's a whole bunch of things that needs to be managed in terms of keeping that thing as a going concern. So the viability of the bar in many ways relies on maintaining distinctions between who's like legitimately there and who they want to keep out. But there's not just that as well. There's also kind of managing a whole bunch of regulations and social issues that go around alcohol in our society. So at the time when the bar started, it was right when the local paper was driving a whole bunch of moral panics about alcohol-fueled violence, and this led to the curfew. He was constantly dealing with the council and licensing laws and local police. I mean, if you want to open, you can't really open a kind of, a whiskey bar in Newcastle because you're not allowed to just serve shots. Even if you want to have a $40 nip of whiskey, you have to get it served with Coke because, Newcastle's apparently too immature to be able to actually drink like that. So in terms of opening a boutique bar, these kind of things are really difficult in terms of being able to manage and create the kind of atmosphere and do the things you want to do. I mean, even he was like under the spotlight sometimes for serving, cocktails after 10 o'clock, and because they had, more than one nip in it or whatever, because you're not allowed to serve doubles. There's also all the kind of obvious economic circumstances. So, in terms of the whole kind of entrepreneur versus selling out thing, to run a bar, you actually have to make lots of money to actually deal with the running costs of, staff and insurance and security and license stuff. So there's all those things to consider. There was a bunch of stuff going on at the time around Renew Newcastle, whether that Newcastle needed to be just more and more gentrified or more and more diversified, and that's still ongoing. So again, this bar was kind of at the forefront of that and was quite prominent in some of the debates. And then there's the whole stuff around kind of, as I was talking about, managing distinction, who's there, the bogans, the hipsters, making sure that it's kind of, not really for Triple J or mainstream music outlets. It distinguishes itself from kind of beer barney type pubs and, clubs like King Street and those kind of things. But even within it, there's a kind of distinction between like indie and DIY that I was talking about last week, and all these things become important in terms of the atmosphere of the bar. So as it develops and gets a bit more popular, there's a bit of discontent around some of the bars. They don't really want to play in formal gigs because most of the time they were playing in squats and empty buildings, and there's a kind of DIY ethic that you shouldn't separate the crowd and the stage too much, and the bar had this kind of little stage, and so there was kind of things going on about that. And there's also some kind of discontent within the scene as like the bar became more popular. That there was a kind of, tall poppy thing going on, I think, as well, and some resentment of what was going on there. And other problems as well, that I can't probably go into too much, to be honest. So, you can see there's a lot going on in terms of just even opening a bar in Newcastle, so it's really difficult. But I'm interested here too, I suppose, in the kind of the balancing act here between, doing this entrepreneurial activity, and trying to maintain a punk ethic. And there's this kind of double language of disinterest that Bourdieu talks about that I think is an interesting way of thinking about this. It's a way that we kind of know that there's a lot of hypocrisies in what we do, whether it's leisure practices or for jobs or whatever, and we tend to develop the kind of this language to where the necessity of the economic imperatives of what we do is disguised in this kind of disinterested way. So Bourdieu gives some kind of interesting examples. When bishops talk about monetary values of pastoral services, they laugh. The price of coffee, of meals, of parish gatherings is not a price but a voluntary offering. These kind of shifts of language are used to kind of hide the economic needs of various activities to make them more about community or social relations or whatever. So balancing act here is difficult in the terms of an economic world reversed, which is kind of how the art world and things like the punk scenes are thought about. And there's like a balancing act between maintaining subcultural cred and able to run a sustainable business. So being disinterested about economics is kind of very hard to maintain under the threat of bank interest. So it's not only about that economic stuff. In terms of the double language of disinterest, there's specific things were chosen in the bar to kind of make sure that the right people come. So the very choice of only having quite expensive boutique beers for people of so-called good taste is a way of kind of symbolically excluding so-called binge drinking bogans or whatever. So even though you can then kind of say that this is kind of appeal to organic sustainability or supporting the local market, there's also a kind of class relation that goes on here. So what I'm talking about here in terms of this double language of disinterest, what a lot of the stuff that happens here is that very rational business decisions, i.e. the necessity, are cloaked in kind of the language of subculture and sustainability or expressions of taste, this kind of distinctive disinterest. So there's a whole bunch of things kind of going on here at once that are needed to kind of make the whole thing hold together. So as I've kind of already outlined, that there's a kind of trajectory going on here from leisure and art and consumption practices. As they become more serious in that kind of social gravity sense, they develop into jobs and careers. And disinterest becomes much more to maintain in that sense. A kind of blasé attitude or a punk attitude towards things is difficult to maintain. So they're reflexive in that sense, but they're very far from individualised in terms of thinking about reflexive modernity. They rely on intense networks of support and cooperation. Importantly too, as I was talking about, these things come and go, and it seems that these kind of subcultural careers are likely to be risky, very precarious and insecure, and very, in many ways, hard to maintain.